Hey everyone! So, I think I've mentioned it before on this channel, but when it comes to liberal leftist America, there are 3 stages of propaganda they like to use, and luckily, in the case of the Santeria Church and its apologists that we're talking about today, we can jump straight to stage 3. So what are these stages exactly? So remember the viral clip of Trump during the presidential debate? So basically you had people from Springfield, Ohio who live in Springfield, Ohio, saying that in Springfield, Ohio, their cats and dogs were being eaten by the migrants that just came there. But luckily, people from the coast informed them, no, that is not happening to you, you're just being racist. And you have to wonder, like, chat, is it racist to care about animal welfare? Or in this case, what I'm talking about today, chat, is it racist to condemn a white guy? So the Springfield, Ohio case was stage 1 of the propaganda. So this is when we're told, oh hey, this thing that you think is happening, it's not actually happening. And stage 2 is when they concede, well, this thing you're talking about, it happens sometimes, but it's so rare, and in the case of globalization, these people mainly want to assimilate, you're being discriminatory because this is a very rare occurrence. And now we get to stage 3, and that's when what's going on is just so obvious that they're forced to admit that, yes, this thing is happening, but it's actually good. And if you have a problem with that, you are the problem. This was also the media's playbook for inflation about a year ago. So today we're going to be talking about the Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus the city of Hialeah. This was a Supreme Court case from 1993, and this was where you had these voodoo practicing migrants. They took the city that they immigrated to all the way to the Supreme Court to assert their right as Americans to sacrifice animals on these altars to demons. They're proud of this practice. They dragged it through 3 different courts, so there's documentation, and so there is no denying it is happening. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the church's religion, which is Santeria. It was brought here to South Florida, but has now made its way all the way to both coasts. I'm going to be going over the court system it went through and how the Supreme Court came to the decision to side with the church. And I'll also just be delving a bit more into the idea of religion in America, the impact of globalization, and my critique of the language surrounding the First Amendment, particularly freedom of religion, how it's defined. And this is going to involve me sharing a lot of facts, but also the opinions and conclusions that I have come to that I derived from these facts. So if hearing things from a socially conservative perspective enrages you, this video is not. And this was a hard video to make for a couple of reasons. First off, the subject matter is animal cruelty. I'm not going to be showing any images or going into any great detail about these practices because I don't want you guys to see that. Although I do encourage everybody to go do research on the barbarism of animal slaughter in the United States, though. And this was also a hard video to make just because while studying the adoption of freedom of religion into the Bill of Rights, I was forced to face this sort of disillusionment. And for what it was at the time it was written, the Constitution and Bill of Rights are these brilliant documents, and so I feel immense frustration with how the Constitution has gone on to be weaponized to protect these abhorrent anti-American behaviors, and also how I think parts of it were written the way they were written because the founders weren't perfect people. A lot of them took bribes and were part of these fundamentally anti-American secret societies that influenced the Constitution ultimately. And this reckoning and what it means for American exceptionalism is also a central theme in the novel that I've been writing, by the way. So definitely subscribe if you're interested in hearing more updates about that and when it'll hopefully be coming out. And so I guess just before we begin, I have to say I'm sorry to be the feeding 2 birds with 1 scone guy, but I care about animal welfare, which is the primary reason why I made this video. You see, in America, we have these things called pet parades. And this is like when communities come together, maybe put pets in cute costumes, and the pets and their owners, they go on this big walk together where on the way, the pets get belly rubs, gourmet treats, fun toys. There's generally food trucks and a fundraising element for things like animal shelters or relief for pets involved in natural disasters. Pets are just really important to the people in this country. They're in our Christmas cards. I have pet health insurance for both my cat and dog. My dog Cody, he gets professional dental cleanings twice a year. But anyways, Let's get into the video. So Santeria is a polytheistic religion originating in Cuba, and the religion was created by West African slaves who were brought into Cuba, who were originally practitioners of this pagan African religion called Yoruba. So they combined Yoruba with the aesthetic elements of Catholicism, and they called it Santeria. Well, sort of. The religion has multiple names, and the lore is actually conflicting. Like, you'll have Orishas, which are what they call these demons that they worship, or in some cases they say they only venerate. And some of these Orishas are simultaneously someone's brother, but also someone's wife, and that's because there is no central text. In this religion, there's no writing, and that way it's been compared to Haitian voodoo and Brazilian candomblé, also because those originate from the Yoruba tradition. Now, in particular, however, there are some of the practitioners that want a Yorubaization of Santeria, meaning they want to remove the Roman Catholic elements from it, which in that case, it would just be Yoruba again. So what they're looking to do is practice Yoruba, just with extra steps, I guess. And the term Santeria, which I'm sure you're wondering, that translates to Way of the Saints, although you have a lot of practitioners who don't agree with that because the Catholic elements are really only aesthetic, and so other practitioners call it Regala de Ocha, referring to the Ocha being another term for the Orisha, again, the demons that they worship. And another name for it is Lukumi, and that is in reference to the colonial Spanish term for the Yoruba people. And like I just made clear, Santeria is a syncretic religion, and I've talked on the channel before about why I think those are a problem. And there's also no consistency in this religion's lore. Like, Santeria is super flexible, like I just mentioned, about some Orishas, they're known to be someone's brother, but then they're also somebody's wife. Well, there's no strict text, no orthodoxy, no central authority, and so it absorbs these religions and cultures that it comes into. And I guess that's because the practitioners originally could not read or write, and so it was all passed down orally and making it really easy to change over time. There are actually theories that the practitioners linking their Orishas to Catholic saints, the reason for that is to hide their practices from the public, so kind of making it seem like they're assimilating. It's like fake assimilation. Now, the Orisha that the church is named after, Babalu I, he is associated with both disease and also healing. So let's get into how this religion works. And I'm only going to be covering the basics, but I encourage everyone to read more about this. It's just I don't have time to go over everything. But what you need to know is that Santeria is far more concerned with practice than it is belief. And I would imagine part of that has to do with the lack of text to study. And so performing ceremonies is a big requirement. That is the biggest thing of all. And there's also a structured hierarchy. So lower level practitioners may not know what the spiritual practices of the higher ranks are. And when I read that, I immediately thought of, just in general, secret societies, like think the Freemasons. And as it turns out, Santeria is oftentimes compared to secret societies in that way, in that the practices are kept secret from the public as well as from the lower ranks. And if you guys have been watching my channel for a while, you know secret societies are one of my special interests. But in Santeria, they believe in a creator, and underneath this creator is the Orisha spirits. They have this sort of deist mindset where they believe that this creator has no interest in the universe or in human affairs, so there's never anything dedicated to him. Nothing is sacrificed for this creator. He is nothing. Every person has a special relationship with an Orisha. They believe that these Orishas influence people's personalities, and these Orishas are venerated, whether it be in the home, in the temple, or a combination of both. Their priests are called santeros, or santeras if they're women. They do have women priestesses. And interestingly, apparently there's this stereotype that all santeros are gay. I could not find any more information about why they believe that, but that is something that goes around their communities. And the religion, of course, requires initiation. People make offerings to the Orishas, and these offerings, they include things like fruit, liquor, flowers, animals, dead animals, or, animal sacrifice. And that is the crux of this video, the animal sacrifice, which we will get into in a moment. And these offerings are also made to gain the protection of the Orisha or to avoid their offense. So these are not benevolent gods. They can get upset and they can punish you when they are upset. So a lot of times when after performing a ceremony, if something goes wrong or it doesn't have the intended effect that the practitioner thought that it would, they didn't get the result they wanted, the assumption is that, oh, we must not have done this ritual correctly. But they believe that the Orishas communicate to them through everyday occurrences, like, oh, I see somebody drop some mangoes at the supermarket. I need to read something. I need to take something out of that. It's like horoscope girlies, but with blood ritual. And another important ritual is the Toque de Santo, where practitioners, they'll be playing drums, singing, and dancing in hopes that one of the members in like this circle, that they get possessed by an Orisha who will communicate through the possessed person. And obviously that implies that some of these practitioners identify as spirit mediums and others are healers. Offerings are supposed to be made often, but at least once a year. And these offerings are also thought to strengthen the Orishas, or thank them, or stop them from causing harm. And oftentimes people will do it in hopes of getting something in return, which we'll get into in a little bit, that it's not always something good, something positive they want in return. And so the animals that they claim that are typically involved in sacrifice include chickens, doves, turtles, guinea pigs, goats. Although in reality, it's more like it's any animal they can get their hands on. For more important rituals, it'll be four-legged animals that are sacrificed. And like I said, I'm not going to go into detail about what that process looks like, but you should know that it's very cruel. And oftentimes, when the animal struggles, they get excited about that, thinking that, oh, well, that means this is going to strengthen the Orisha even more, this animal's struggle. It's a horrible thing. And as for the animals of choice that I just listed, most of these, if not all of them, are animals that you would get at a pet store. That is not in line with American values to be sacrificing them to demons. We pet goats at petting zoos. We do not put these animals on altars and murder them. I also read, interestingly, that some of the practitioners view animal sacrifice as a sort of decent substitute for human sacrifice. And there have been persistent rumors for hundreds of years in Cuba that the Santeros sacrifice children. And that's a rumor, there's no, I personally have no evidence of that, but that's not shocking considering that it's derived from the same religion that created Haitian voodoo, and in Haiti, they eat people. And the idea is that the Orisha during this sacrifice eats the blood of the victim, and then the head of the animal gets placed on the altar. Really unthinkable to the assimilated American mind. And this is most times done in private, but as the residents of Hialeah will attest, the remnants of these sacrifices will end up on the streets, beaches, and parks. And I'm going to link all of the articles I'm about to reference, but the Miami Herald published in 2019 a piece called Watch Your Step, Miami. There might be a severed cow's tongue on your running path. And in this article, the main thing was that a bunch of joggers found a severed cow's tongue on a running path, so not something you buy from a grocery store, as though like a freshly cut out tongue of a cow. And you have to wonder, did that animal suffer? But also, this article talks about how outside of the Miami courthouse, it's so common to find goat's legs, pig's heads. So again, the pig not mentioned in their ideal list of sacrificial animals, but you find pig's heads outside of the courthouse, bananas and mangoes. Those are among the items deposited in hopes of justice or revenge. So like I said, sometimes what they're asking for from the Orishas is not something benevolent, it's something evil. So I mentioned my concern about the cow tongue, but when it comes to these goats, pigs, and cows' body parts, you have to wonder, were they at least dead before they got their extremities cut off? And if you're concerned about animal cruelty law violations, you should be. There was a priestess in 2016 that was convicted of extreme animal cruelty, and they do it with no remorse. This woman had no remorse because it's part of her culture. They don't value the lives of animals, and I'm sure this has been the case since she was a child, that she grew up watching animal sacrifice and sees no issue with it. They don't care about the horrific conditions animals are left in before being killed in a painful way. It just means nothing to them. There was also testimony in the district court case. Before this reached the Supreme Court, there was the district court that the method they used to kill these animals did not necessarily kill them instantly, leading to suffering, which would be in violation of animal cruelty laws, but those are really hard to convict on when in secular slaughterhouses these violations occur all the time, and also the killing itself is usually done in private. So these animals, at the very least, are extremely fearful in the moments and potentially days leading up to their deaths. So the blood is drained into a clay pot, but it is unknown how it's disposed of. But in some cases, these containers of blood are just found in public. And I'm going to link an article detailing the farms that raise these chickens specifically for sacrifice and what these animals go through in the process. I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm going to link that for you. So I found this really interesting post from the Miami subreddit. So Reddit being a notoriously grossly liberal site where it's just you have all where the extremists come together, the degenerate liberal extremists come together to convene. And really interesting though, even they do not seem to be in favor of Santeria. So here's the post. The original poster says, "Can people stop leaving Santeria offerings in public places, especially when it is animal carcasses, please? Respectfully." And then he goes on to explain, "There's a long row of palm trees next to a major street that I live and walk by frequently, and someone keeps leaving bunches of bananas and other fruit, as well as dead animal carcasses in plastic bags at the foot of the palm trees, close to the sidewalk all the time. Not only do I feel awful for whatever animal it was, but especially in this heat, the carcasses smell so bad and attract so many flies that I can't even walk by there anymore. I'm all for practicing spirituality, but not if it hurts others, even animals, and not if it impedes on others. No one wants to walk by a bunch of smelly carcasses. Also, does anyone have any idea what this specific offering is supposed to do?" And someone replies, "My understanding is the whole point of Santeria is leaving the carcass somewhere that is high traffic so the bad spirits can be transferred on to something else and carried to faraway places. Private sacrifice and proper burial defeats the purpose." And someone else says, "My cheating ex had a dead rooster or hen in a plastic bag left on his porch." There's another reply that reads, "This is the worst part about being a freight train conductor in Hialeah, constantly having to look out to not step in animal sacrifices left on the tracks." And one more, "Because they are tied to a religious practice, no removal service will touch it. You could try removing it yourself, but that would be considered messing around with the orishas, so careful you don't end up with a maldición." And that is where we get into mysticism. So really interesting, and it was something I hadn't even thought about before, but I researched for the purpose of this video. There are no laws in the US that punish malevolent mystic practices. And apparently those fall under the category of belief, which are protected by the First Amendment. And I even came up with this extreme example. So imagine that someone films a video of themselves performing a ritual where they ask their demons to drop a piano on somebody's head. And the next day, a piano is dropped on this person's head, and this practitioner would even go to the police and show them this video saying, "Yeah, I am responsible for this because I put a curse on this person wanting this to happen." There is no course of legal action that could be taken against that person, even though this highly improbable event occurred after they put a curse on them. So I thought that was really crazy. Mysticism is regarded as belief and therefore harmless. But, I think a lot of people would argue that killing animals in the name of it is not harmless. And hopefully one day animal sacrifice will get the Reynolds v. United States treatment in that belief doesn't mean you can perform illegal acts. Hopefully one day that this kind of sacrifice will be made illegal. And I'm sure a response people are going to have to me is, "Well, Hannah, dark magic isn't real." My argument back would be the elites in our society would disagree with you on that. Catholicism would disagree with you on that. And that is my biggest issue, I would say, with derivatives of Catholicism, like the Protestant sect. The syncretic Christianity that came to America first rejected mysticism, sometimes for the sole purpose of just rejecting transubstantiation. But when you reject one part of it, you reject the other side of it too. The other side being you reject the existence of the dark arts. So this gets inadvertently downplayed, these evil things, and what ends up happening is you are allowing the Santeros, so people who practice the dark arts, regardless of your disbelief, into this country, and they are here with the intention of raising hell. And like I said, this country was not founded by Catholics, and so these misbeliefs about mysticism and what even the practical effects of that is permeates our culture and laws. And here's just one more article about what the Santeria Church has been up to here in South Florida. This is from iTeam. This was written about animal sacrifices being left in public places. I'll link that down below. So there was a Palm Beach County woman who saw this strange formation of 4 cardboard boxes, each at the corner of an intersection. And so she went up to these boxes to see what that was about. And she tipped one of them over, only to find there was a lamb leg inside. And then she says, when I went over to the next box, there was another lamb leg. Each box contained a different quarter of the lamb. She says there were bones sticking out. It was bloody. And now there is a Florida statute that mandates that a person should dispose of an animal carcass by burning or burying it at least 2 feet below the ground. But like we just read in that Reddit post, that would defeat the purpose of Santeria following those ordinances, because the sacrifice needs to be left in public so that the orishas can attach themselves to objects or people passing by to allow them to move farther. And the statute goes on to say that it is a second-degree misdemeanor to dump an animal carcass on any public road or right-of-way. And despite this state public nuisance law, the chief of police, Captain Blakeman of West Palm Beach, said that these cases are rarely prosecuted. He says that it's difficult to build a case against on something like this because the witnesses do not usually come forward, so making it impossible to know if the animal was killed humanely, who left the sacrifice, and why. And even if someone were to admit to leaving the animal remains, Blakeman says that they most likely would only be hit with a citation for improper disposal of an animal. And even that does not happen very often. And the article goes on to talk about how Santeria practitioners don't willingly talk about their faith, so they cannot be pinned for these crimes. That goes back to the secret society element of this religion, where even a lot of times if they are asked, do you belong to the church? The answer will be no, because the whole thing is very secretive. So it basically amounts to what is legal terrorism. You have American citizens being terrorized by these unassimilated people practicing voodoo. So what were these Hialeah ordinances that led to this case going all the way up to the Supreme Court? So it was on June 9th, 1987, that the town of Hialeah first got wind of the fact that the Church of Lukumi Babalu I bought a property in Hialeah and intended to use it for Santeria worship purposes. And so once the residents found out what Santeria was, they were all very upset about this. So there was an emergency public session held on this day. And at this session, you had councilmen as well as the church president, Ernesto Pichardo, speaking. And really interesting on Ernesto Pichardo, so he's the president of the Santeria Church. He's like the second highest rank that they have in the church. And in 2011, he made this incredible statement in an interview saying that people misunderstand Santeria. It's about worshiping nature. And I'm not sure how leaving containers full of blood and rotting, disrespected animal carcasses is worshiping nature, but I guess sometimes a lie is so big, some people will be inclined to believe it. But anyways, so at this emergency session, you had Councilman Silvio Cardoso stating that this religion is, and this is a quote, in violation of everything this country stands for. And I am certainly in agreement with that. I'll be getting into that later. And then you had Councilman Andres Mejides pointed out how animal sacrifice like this is not permitted in the Bible. And then you had Councilman Julio Martinez said that in Cuba, and this is a quote, people were put in jail for practicing this religion. And the audience actually applauded for that last one there. So you have this religion that is, people are put into prison in other countries for practicing, but they were somehow let in through our immigration system and are now weaponizing our Constitution so they can practice it here. And then Ernesto Pichardo, he gave a quick testimony about the religion, I'm sure saying something along the lines of, no. Like, yes, we slaughter animals brutally, but this is about worshiping nature. And he was met with jeering from the audience being the people living in Hialeah, the residents. And so at the end of this session, the city council passed a resolution announcing its commitment to, quote, prohibit all religious groups which are inconsistent with public morals, peace, or safety. And then the city went on to pass another resolution incorporating Florida's existing animal cruelty statute into the city code. And then the city attorney obtained the Florida Attorney General's opinion concluding that the state statute did not permit ritual animal sacrifice. And so then September of that year, the city council, they unanimously passed these 3 new ordinances. And what they did was criminalize sacrifices of animals for any type of ritual, regardless or not the flesh or blood of the animal is to be consumed. And then, of course, what you may think of in that case is, oh, well, what about like kosher and halal slaughter? They made an exemption for kosher slaughterhouses, regular slaughterhouses, hunting, fishing, pest extermination, euthanasia of stray animals, and feeding live rabbits to greyhounds. And this ordinance in particular was extremely ill-conceived and is the reason why this ultimately ended up getting overturned in the Supreme Court. And like, in my opinion, I also find it extremely frustrating that kosher practices were exempt, because if you don't know, kosher and halal slaughter practices are immensely cruel. They are unnecessarily barbaric, and they only exist because when it comes to slaughter laws in the US, they get exemptions from it. So it's really crazy how freedom of religion in this country just allows for cruelty against animals on every level. Like, kosher and halal practices require animals to be fully conscious and in pain while their throats get slit. It's disgusting. And so this fails in the Supreme Court because of the sentiment. Had it been framed as being something done for the safety of the animals, maybe it could have gone over better. And what that did by only applying this to religiously motivated conduct, it ended up failing the general applicability standard in the Supreme Court. So the church filed a lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida. And during this time, the judge overseeing this granted immunity to the individual city council members involved, as well as the mayor. This particular judge also, in the end, granted a summary judgment that was in favor, upholding the ordinances. So here's a little bit more information about that. So you just heard about these anti-slaughter laws at the state of Florida level. So what those were, so there is an exemption for ritual slaughter that applies to only religious slaughtering of animals for food. Now, the Hialeah ordinances, the ones that they put together pretty quickly, only prohibit sacrificing animals where the primary purpose is not food consumption. And so, the first court that looked at these cases came to the conclusion that there is no conflict between these 2 ordinances. And animal sacrifice also violates Florida Statute 82812, which makes it a criminal violation for one to unnecessarily or cruelly kill an animal. And the Attorney General's opinion on this noted that the ritual killing of an animal does not constitute a necessary killing. And then you have the Hialeah Ordinance, which defines sacrifice as to unnecessarily kill, torment, torture, or mutilate an animal in a public or private ritual or ceremony not for the primary purpose of food consumption. So you have the Hialeah Ordinance and the Florida statutes that are consistent with this treatment of animal sacrifice. The difference is here that the Florida statute was not the one that ended up being brought to the Supreme Court. So, of course, I just mentioned all of those ordinances and statutes that seem to be compatible or at least not contradicting each other, which is why the court had no issue with this. But you actually got some really interesting testimonies during the United States District Court that I wanted to talk about a little bit. So they brought in Dr. Raul Huseman, who is a research psychologist, and he's done extensive research on the development of aggressive and violent behavior in children and adults, and his specialty is in studying the effects of observation of violence and what that does to the development of such behavior. So he testified that in the observation of animal sacrifice, particularly in the circumstances of an initiation rite, where a number of animals are sacrificed, would detrimentally affect the mental health of a child and the behavior in such a way that it would be detrimental to the community in which the child resides. Specifically, the observation would be likely to produce psychological processes that promote greater tolerance of aggressive and violent behavior and might even increase the possibility of aggressive and violent behavior by the child himself. And so he says that there are 3 psychological processes that are involved here. 1 being desensitization, 2 being tolerance, and 3 being imitation. He talks about how a child is more likely to imitate and be influenced by actors that they perceive to be of high status. So if a child watches someone important in their church commit a violent act, the effects seem to be exacerbated. And so this effect would be strongest with multiple acts that are spaced out in time, so witnessing multiple animal sacrifices. And Dr. Huseman concluded that the child's observation of animal sacrifice would be likely to increase the probability that the child will behave aggressively and violently, not just against animals, but against humans. I thought that was really interesting because while researching this Santeria stuff, I came across several news articles where there have been multiple instances in the last few years in Florida where a Santeria ritual turns into people murdering each other. They get into arguments, and their conflict resolution is to just kill somebody. So then this case was brought to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals because Ernesto was not satisfied. Even though the people of Hialeah made it very clear they do not want this church here, they find these practices barbaric and anti-American, he was like, you know what? I want to do it anyway. I don't care that I'm terrorizing all of you. We are going to commit our animal sacrifices in Hialeah. So this went to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, but ultimately that affirmed the district court's ruling in 1991. And then it was brought to the Supreme Court. The church petitioned the Supreme Court, and overseeing the case that was granted in 1992, the court heard oral arguments on November 4th, 1992, and their decision was issued on June 11th, 1993. And in what I think shocked a lot of people, in a unanimous 9-0 ruling, the Supreme Court struck down the ordinances, finding that they were not neutral and generally applicable, but instead targeted specific religious practices and thereby violating the First Amendment's guarantee of the free exercise of religion. And it's not the case that these people believe animal sacrifice, these justices believe animal sacrifice is good or can't in a way be banned, but they could not overlook the clear intention that Hialeah had that would be in violation of the First Amendment. So Justice Anthony Kennedy stated in his decision that religious beliefs need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible to others in order to merit First Amendment protection. This was also a very rare Clarence Thomas L. Very disappointing. But there were a few of the justices who only had concurrence in part. In the case of Justice Harry Blackmun, only concurrence in judgment. So I recommend looking into those. But really interesting what Scalia had to say. Defended the use of the Smith test. So what is the Smith test exactly? So that can be better known as the neutrality and general applicability test. And it comes from the Employment Division versus Smith from 1990, and this was where the Supreme Court established a two-part standard for analyzing free exercise claims. So in this case, it has to be that a law must neither target religious practice nor apply to only religious behaviors. And the deal with the Hialeah ordinances is that they weren't designed to apply evenly to all similar behaviors, secular or religious, right from the start. For a law to be deemed generally applicable, it has to apply broadly, regardless of motive, secular versus religious, and avoid selective exemptions that allow certain behaviors while prohibiting the same behavior for religious reasons. So, first off, they exempted secular animal slaughter, but banned ritual sacrifice, so that is clearly geared towards religious practices, and it lacked general applicability, so you had these exemptions for non-religious slaughter, kosher practices, hunting, and that more demonstrated these ordinances were clearly geared towards Santeria alone. And so the second part of the Smith test, the strict scrutiny, is if a law fails the first test because it's either not neutral or not generally applicable, and it must satisfy the highest justification, which is a compelling governmental interest, narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. And so they obviously failed strict scrutiny. The city failed to show that the ordinances served a compelling interest in a narrowly tailored way, since similar secular activities were allowed without regulation. And they were also clearly discriminatory, even though, I would say, for good reason. But anyways, the laws appeared aimed at suppressing the Santeria religion itself, and as Kennedy said, legislators may not devise mechanisms designed to persecute or oppress a religion or its practices. And for those reasons, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of the Santeria Church. But, despite this particular Supreme Court ruling, in other parts of the country, there are very similar ordinances that are being upheld because the voodoo practitioners didn't take them to the Supreme Court. So in 1990, just a couple of years after the Hialeah ordinances, you actually had Los Angeles enact an ordinance banning ritual animal sacrifice, and the punishment for violating such ordinance would be punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a fine of up to $1,000. And the city justified this ban, citing concerns over public health and animal cruelty, particularly in response to specific complaints they have gotten about mutilated animals being found in public spaces. And this ordinance was challenged by religious groups, but just like the Hialeah ordinance, it was upheld by a judge that ruled the law did not infringe upon religious freedoms. The difference here is that it just wasn't taken all the way to the Supreme Court. And so despite these challenges from religious groups, such as the Orisha Temple, which practices the Yoruba religion, so basically Santeria, this was upheld by the Superior Court judge in 1990, and the judge, interestingly, ruled that the law did not infringe upon the group's religious rights and noted that the ordinance did not prevent the practice of the religion itself, only the specific act of animal sacrifice. But of course, if this were to be brought to the Supreme Court, it's definitely possible they would be given the Hialeah treatment. And so this whole idea that animal cruelty can just be allowed because of the First Amendment is super upsetting, but I found this really interesting statement from the Free Speech Center that I wanted to read to you guys. So this is called Animal Cruelty Laws Could Be at Issue in the Future. So I mentioned Justice Blackmun, Harry Blackmun from the Supreme Court, and in his concurrence on decision only, he explained that one day the court would have to decide the issue of animal sacrifice for religious purposes under a statute that met the neutrality test. A harder case would be presented if a religious group were requesting an exemption from a generally applicable anti-cruelty law. So the result in the case before the court today, and the fact that every member of the court concurs in that result, does not necessarily reflect the court's views of the strength of a state's interest in prohibiting cruelty to animals. So that would be the strict scrutiny part of this, where we're talking about a necessary government interest that would override the general applicability. The number of organizations that have filed briefs on behalf of this interest, however, demonstrates this is not a concern to be treated lightly. Lukumi Babalu was essentially an easy case because these ordinances were written so poorly. The court has not yet revisited the issue of animal sacrifice. Hey guys, so also worth mentioning that in 2009 there was another Santeria animal sacrifice case brought to the Supreme Court, and this was a case, it was called Merced versus Casson, Merced being the Santeria priest who had violated Texas ordinances that prohibited the slaughter of four-legged animals. So he, of course, brought it all the way to the Supreme Court, saying that is in violation of his rights. And in that case, the court, without using the First Amendment, also once again agreed with the Santeria priest, saying that the ordinances, and this is a quote, substantially burden the plaintiff's free exercise of religion without advancing a compelling governmental interest using the least restrictive means, and that he was entitled to do so under the Texas Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So yeah, like I said, the Los Angeles issue, and there are other ones too, they just never made it to the Supreme Court. They weren't challenged that much. And so I sort of like what he's getting at too here, the justice, is that right now animals, they don't have rights. So animals are property in the United States. And I'm going to tell you what the current protections for animals are. So there's the Humane Slaughter Act, also known as the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act, and this act was passed in 1958 and amended in 1978. And this act requires that animals be stunned into unconsciousness before slaughter to minimize pain. Now, this is the one I was talking about when it comes to kosher and halal getting exemptions. So the idea is, we are stunning them so that it's not cruel, but religion trumps everything else, I guess. Barbaric religious practices, un-American religious practices, they get exemptions. So livestock do feel pain when they are being killed the kosher and halal way. There's also the Endangered Species Act, so that was from 1973. This protects fish, mammals, and birds, as well as some plants listed as threatened or endangered in the United States and beyond. So the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, that outlines the procedures for federal agencies to follow regarding these listed species, as well as the criminal and civil penalties for such violations. And this law is chiefly administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries Service. And then there is the PACT, which stands for Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture. And this was signed into law only in 2019, actually. So this was under the first Trump presidency. The PACT Act makes some of the most egregious forms of animal cruelty illegal. I'm not going to list them for you because they're hard to hear, but please research the PACT, as that is the newest sort of animal quote-unquote rights protections that they have gotten. So definitely read more about that. Then you still have people out there and activists saying that not being able to torture an animal is in violation of their rights. Also, Native Americans are allowed to possess the body parts of bald eagles despite them being endangered. But people who are not Native Americans, so people who are not registered members of tribes, who are not citizens of tribes, they cannot. We cannot. And they're also allowed to apply for permits to kill bald eagles, all in the name of religion, these barbaric, extremely anti-Christian religions. So here we have kosher and halal slaughter violating the Humane Slaughter Act, and then you have Native Americans and their religious practices violating the Endangered Species Act. This is literally our national animal we're talking about with eagles, who are very endangered. They get exemptions. But something else that I found really compelling in my research was Reynolds versus the United States. Now, this was from 1879. You might be familiar with this one. It's a pretty notorious case. So this was a ruling that upheld the ban on polygamy. And the court said that allowing polygamy would set a precedent for unacceptable things done in the name of religion in the future. And they listed specifically, such as human sacrifice. And I wonder, would that still stand up against strict scrutiny today? And if it would, I wonder if the filings of people such as Dr. Huseman on the effects of children witnessing animal sacrifice could potentially be used in rulings in the future. So the thing is, you guys, as I'm researching this and coming to conclusions, I'm also spending late into the evening researching loopholes to this. I'm trying to become a lawyer. Basically, I went to law school these past couple of weeks that I haven't posted because I've been trying to figure out what is the way around the First Amendment here, because the First Amendment is being weaponized, and I think I'll get into it later. I think it was in a way poorly conceived, that in a way that allowed this type of thing to happen. So I was trying to figure out how can we protect the rights of animals when you have these religions coming in and insisting it is their right to be able to harm them. And also, I know this is not a video on secular slaughterhouses, but it needs to be acknowledged that they get away with violations and improper slaughter that leads to suffering all the time. There are so many documentaries on this. And, there's a monopoly on meat production, so these executives, they can just get away with whatever they want. So there needs to be slaughterhouse reform laws, strict oversight of these facilities, and, believing you have the right to eat animals doesn't mean you have the right to treat them cruelly in the process. We are stewards of creation. There is so much evidence of animals being capable of pain and fear. It's an observable thing, too. You shouldn't have to read scientific papers about it to understand that it is an observable thing, but if you need to, those also exist. And since there is so much evidence of animals being capable of pain and fear, new animal protection legislation might make it possible to give them some sort of, at least a semblance of rights in this country. And now I'm sure there are cynics who are going to tell me that, in Christianity, God asserted humans have dominion over animals, Hannah. They don't have rights. Well, first off, I'm talking about rights as a legal classification in the United States, okay? And then secondly, having dominion over animals means we are responsible for them and have to treat them with dignity because they are creation. In my opinion, there just has to be some kind of legislation that bans all animal killing, all animal killing that isn't for food, regardless of religion, and doing so must be the quickest and least painful way possible. And also, as stewards of creation, it's we have dominion over animals and therefore need to also humanely end their suffering, in the cases of sick animals. But I guess that would be an exemption, right? And that's where the problems come in. But anyways, maybe licenses need to be involved. Sorry, hunters, but the religious animal sacrificers, globalization, and poorly written amendments ruined it for everyone. Really interesting, several European countries have straight up banned kosher and halal practices. So if this video was not controversial enough for you guys yet, here's this. So I believe that there is a fundamental problem with freedom of religion as defined in the Bill of Rights. It suggests that religions practiced by the people don't matter. It's a rejection of mysticism, and then what you end up with is social contracts that can be violated when it's just anything goes. It would be hell on earth akin to the Aztec Empire if, let's say, somehow, we're on the road to population collapse in the United States, but we're also mass importing people. So if one day, if Afro-Caribbean religions were the dominant forces in our society, it would be hell on earth akin to the Aztec Empire here, but it would all be constitutional. The social fragmentation that occurs when Christians are forced to coexist with demon worshippers is a really big problem. You have Christians and Christian-aligned people in terms of values who could not fathom harming animals, and they're forced to exist in a society where the government forces them to live amongst and tolerate those who do harm animals. The Constitution also was not created with the idea in mind that the United States would be globalized and weaponized. It's just the truth that this pro-multiculturalism propaganda is insane. And there's a difference between having people who don't look like living together versus believing it is best practice to have people who don't share the same cultural values living together. It is just a fact that globalization and the Constitution cannot work together. When you take a high-trust society, like the United States in general, and allow mass immigration, what you end up with is a lot of immigrants who came here with the sole purpose of exploiting our system because they couldn't do it in the country where they were coming from. That is certainly not always the case. Here in South Florida, we have the Santeria practitioners, but we also have the other Cubans who assimilated and want to participate in American society and make it better for everybody because they were forced to flee their country. I'm not talking about all immigrants, but we cannot deny the fact that there are people like the Santeria practitioners who fled Cuba from persecution, and they came here because they knew it would be harder to be persecuted here. Despite the fact that they knew Americans would be just as disgusted as the other Cubans were with their animal sacrifice practices, but they don't care. They came here to exploit the system, and they did that by bringing their animal sacrifice rights to the Supreme Court, practically bankrupting Hialeah while distressing its residents in the process. And now imagine the audacity, right? You come into the United States with nothing to offer its government or its citizens. Like, no hard-to-find skills or anything. A lot of these people these Santeria practitioners could not even read. But then you decide, well, we're not going to leave it, I just can't offer anything, but I'm taking up space and jobs. Also, I'm going to torment the people in the city I decided to move to while extracting resources from them. And then you go through these 3 courts to assert your right to do something that is at its core un-American. You frighten the people of Hialeah, disgust them with your animal sacrifice, and then pollute their town with the carcasses, thus destroying their home values and city's reputation. Those kinds of people do not belong here. Their relationship to this nation is parasitic, and I know that's almost like a pearl-clutching statement, like, Hannah, you can't say that, but there are some uncomfortable truths that need to be said. Now, when it comes to fleeing persecution, the first question that the government should be asking should always be, why are you being persecuted? And there are some cases, like I talked about on the channel before, you have like Syrian refugees, where the CIA swoops in regime changes and results in extreme persecution where they're forced to flee. And that's a moral dilemma where our government forced them out of their own country, but then now they're coming to the US and not assimilating, and it's not fair to anybody. You have Christians getting mass murdered when these regime changes happen, but there are many cases throughout history and now where people are persecuted for good reason. And our immigration system should have considered if their values and their goals and what they have to offer is in line with Americans. They should find out. Are they coming here to exploit our laws and our people? Like, allowing the Santeria practitioners to come here was a failure on the federal level. This country is not for everybody. That's another pearl-clutching statement, I know, but that is also the truth. And I can see already people being like, oh my gosh, she's a Christian nationalist. Wrong. I'm a Catholic nationalist. And sorry, I just don't see that term as an insult because I have a thing that maybe you don't, and it's called foresight and the ability to analyze history.
Be a little less snarky.
That was snarky, I'm sorry. A question that comes from this is, why does freedom of religion exist in such a broad sense? Like, why was the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, so broad in their definition of freedom of religion? And this is something I don't have the answer to, but I have theories, and I think it's a mesh of a lot of things. So part of it was certainly that the founders did not anticipate the globalization we now have. Like early on, Native American religious practices were banned. Through like 1980, I think, was when those bans on their religious, tribal, demonic practices were lifted. So they were aware, the founders, they were aware that anti-American religions existed, but it must have been the case then that they did not think those would be brought to the US because the ones that were already here, they had banned. And I also don't think that, for the most part, freedom of religion was born from the purest, most libertarian, let everyone live the way they want sense. There's this uncomfortable truth that a significant portion of the founders were deep in secret societies. So like Santeria, these secret societies, they have a hierarchy that are rumored to delve into dark spiritual matters the higher up you go. And maybe some of these founders were concerned they would be found out, and they did not want to face any kind of legal trouble, any kind of social repercussions for being a part of these kinds of things. And, that is just kind of a fact, though. Like, there's Masonic imagery all over Washington, and Master Freemasonry is certainly a religion. It's also the case that the biggest individual financer and broker of the Revolutionary War was not a Christian. And I'm sure Haym Solomon, that's his name, that he would have wanted something in return for the money that he did not even ask for back. Besides financing the war, Solomon was also known to be an advocate for religious freedom. He was also a master mason, and something that he wanted in exchange for the money may have been the ability for his people to immigrate to the US with constitutional rights for their religion. And, some of the biggest advocates for freedom of religion, like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, they all received personal loans from Solomon. So I think that freedom of religion was born of multiple reasons, but I have no reason to believe that the founders thought that anti-Christian practices like animal sacrifice would just be happening in public as a result of it. The laws against some Native American barbaric religious practices supports that. But there's always been religious contention in the US regardless of the Bill of Rights. Like, you had people and states trying to disenfranchise each other for a long time, whether it be Quakers or Catholics or Presbyterians. It was pretty silly. Though, like, the worst thing they could accuse Catholics of was, taking orders from the Vatican. And I guess maybe they were worried that order would be, oh, hey, do not fight in this war the U.S. is going to go fight in. And, Catholics, they weren't sacrificing animals or harming people. Any scandal that comes out of the Catholic Church has been met with internal policing from Catholics. Catholics don't defend bad things that have happened or deny that they've happened. So constitutionally, and the point I'm making is that constitutionally, allowing all Christians to practice their religions makes sense. In a cultural sense, they're just not that incompatible. And these Christian values, because they were brought here first, before anyone else, they have seeped into American culture. And, with the exception of a few antisocial people, we all have respect for animals. There's no Christian denomination that sacrifices animals. We respect the earth, but then you have these voodoo people that pollute and destroy their surroundings. And Americans find that reprehensible. You can't pray to God in Christianity and beg him to harm your enemies. The answer will be no. And if you're Catholic, you would go to hell for asking that question. So you don't have to like it, but the literature makes it very clear that this nation was founded on Christian values, maybe a little deist, despite Christianity not being explicitly named in the key documents because of freedom of religion. Most Americans hold Christian values, even those who don't identify with mainstream religion would agree with you that you should treat people with kindness, forgiveness, and be stewards of creation. And you can argue those aren't exclusively Christian values, but Christianity brought them to America. Most Americans who either knew about it or know about it now are disgusted with Santeria and its animal sacrifice practices. As a nation, we love animals. Dogs are pets, not tools. We see cows. When we see cows out in public, even when we know we eat those animals, we think, I don't want anything bad to happen to that particular cow. Even the most liberal, anti-religion women, the Brooklynites, they keep cats as pets and they treat them very well. And even if you're a liberal atheist, you probably hold these values because they became American values. And before humanity decided to transcend God during World War II, post-World War II,
personal values came from established religions. And I'm sure there are people watching who will say, oh, well, you don't get it. Like, my Christian parents, they're evil. They kicked me out because I'm in a bisexual polycule. First of all, I agree with your parents. That is degenerate. Second of all, they didn't throw you off a building as an honor killing. They aren't slitting the throats of chickens as an offering to the demon they want to facilitate your downfall. They just won't support your lifestyle. That's pretty benign. And like I said, the founders did not consider globalization. They figured that these different denominations of Christianity could get along with each other if they were forced to, because they really weren't all that different. Although less compatible than the Christian sects are with each other, the founders and many Americans got along with the Jews and Muslims that they met. But Santeria is the perfect example when making the argument that two religions at odds cannot coexist. So here's the conclusion that I've come to. When Christians and Americans find the idea of torturing and needlessly mutilating animals so abhorrent that it makes them angry, they cannot coexist with a religious group that doesn't acknowledge the sanctity of life. So really interesting reference here. So in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, he makes the argument that rage has a place and purpose. And I would say this would be the place for rage. To coexist and tolerate Santeria's practices would be in violation of the Christian and American ethos that compels us to put a stop to such vile injustice. If we don't try to stop it, we're not Christian or American anymore. So we cannot coexist. America is just not for everybody. I know there are people who love to say, no one's illegal on stolen land, and if you need to, go back into my illegal immigration video where I explain why that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But yeah, America is not for everybody. America is not for Santeros. America is not for voodoo practitioners. America is not for polygamists. America is not for people who want to marry children. America is not for supremacist religions that think they have the right to harm others. America is for Americans. And sometimes for those willing to become American. And Americans at their core hold many Christian values.